Hello, everyone. So welcome, and I'm glad you all decided to join us. This is great, fantastic to see so many faces. So my name is Dean Prather Johnson. I'm the Dean of Business, Computer Science, and IT. And as you know, we've actually been having a number of these, what we call Distinguished Speaker Series monthly. And it's in conjunction with a partnership between the Business, Computer Science, and IT pathway and our wonderful virtual student center. And so myself and Alicia has kind of brainstormed and thought about what the students need and how this is really important components to the extension of our students' learning, right? Co-curricular activities certainly provides additional learning outside of the classroom on some really important topics that we thought would be beneficial to both our business and IT students, computer science as well. So I wanted to, first of all, establish that, as you know, we started this as of January. This is obviously our February event, and we'll be having our March event regarding women. However, I'll tell you more about that at the end of our session. I also wanted to let you know that this particular event, we have partnered with our wonderful STEM program. And we have today, I want to introduce both our moderator and our co-host, and that is Ms. Jada Hall. Ms. Jada Hall is our program coordinator of the Intercultural Learning and Women's Center, and she is also the coordinator and lead of our wonderful STEM program. I'm hoping that she tells you a little bit about that, and then she's going to take it off and introduce our wonderful speaker. Ms. Hall?
Thank you, Nancy, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see so many people in the house today. Can everyone hear me okay? Just want to make sure. All right, thumbs up, thank you. All right, so we're excited for our guest speaker. Before we begin, I do want to give a shout out to all of the STEM Promise scholars in the room. The STEM Promise program is TCC's full scholarship for students interested in science, technology, engineering, and math related degree programs here at TCC. And one of the great things about this program is that it is geared towards more women and more minority students being included in the STEM fields. Because I think a lot of us know that traditionally those populations have been underrepresented. So it kind of goes with our theme for the day, the business of justice. So I want to let you know that the link is in the chat for the STEM Promise program. If you are a current student with less than 24 credits, you may be eligible. If you happen to be a prospective TCC student, you also may be eligible. So please check that out and get more information. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful guest speaker for the day. All right. Jordyne Blaise, Esquire, is a diversity, inclusion, and equity consultant, strategist, and public speaker. She is the current head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Bluebird Bio, a global biotech company headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and runs her own private consulting firm that provides coaching, training, strategic planning services to organizations seeking to build or bolster their diversity programs. Very needed today. Blaise has been published nationally as a leading scholar activist in the areas of civil rights, Black feminist, legal, and social theory, and intersectionality. Her contributions have been featured in The Atlantic, Time Magazine, and Essence Magazine. She earned an Associate of Arts in English from Broward Community College in Davie, Florida, and both a Bachelor of Arts in English and Juris Doctor from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. She is a native of Miami, Florida, and Jordyne currently resides in Raleigh, North Carolina with her partner, Robert, and dog, Dade. Without further ado, please welcome our guest, Jordyne Blaise.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's good to meet you. I'm gonna take just a second to share my screen, but thank you, Jada, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, Dean Prather Johnson, for having me, and thank you, Alicia Phillips, for inviting me in this space as well. As mentioned in this really super exciting bio, I am also an alum of a community college program. And so I'm really excited to be with y'all today. I work in a STEM adjacent or in STEM doing diversity work. And so I'm really excited to hear there are so many STEM Promise scholars on the line. So I look forward to hearing more from you. So I will take some time, and I'm glad that I include my dog Dade in my bio, because you may hear him snoring in the background. Just so you know, that's not me. I am wide awake and excited to be here, but pardon my very comfortable dog. So I will share with you my kind of screen here, focusing on the business of justice. And I really was excited to hear about this theme. I am going to point you to the picture that I chose as my cover photo, and I'll tell you what the picture is, but I'll give you some more context around that picture in just a moment. But this picture was from September 2013 or 2014. And this was in September, and September is National Sickle Cell Disease Awareness Month. And during the month of September, I donated blood. And you may be shocked to believe this, but this was my first time donating blood in my entire life. And this was in 2014. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But that was inspired me to do it on that day. And this became full circle. And I'll talk a little bit more about how and why, but just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So before I talk about the business of justice, I have to talk about the justice of business, because I think it's a critical part of the way that I operate and the way that I approach my work. And what I mean by that is I imagine the business of justice, right, to be, hey, I'm interested in doing justice work. Like, what kind of jobs can I have in order to continue my interest in justice work? And I will get to that, I promise. But I really want to sort of ground up in this concept of the justice of business. And what I mean by that is I have a fundamental belief that businesses, organizations, nonprofits, whatever the organization is, should really operate in a way that grounds them with a moral compass, right? I think we're used to seeing businesses and framing capitalism as sort of an exploitative practice that says, how can we make more money? How can we make more money? How can we save money? I think my own personal opinion is that's probably and very likely true. However, I do believe that businesses are just entities made up of people. They are run by people, they are sustained by people, and they exist to hopefully serve people in some way, right? Because as a society, that's what we do. And so a lot of my work is rooted in this concept that as a business, as an organization, you should have a moral compass. You should have something that you believe in. You should have something that tells you like this is the right thing to do, right? Because we know that businesses often are sometimes forced or sometimes in positions to make decisions that impact a lot of people. For example, some of you, this may predate a lot of you on this call, but I grew up in South Florida, so I'm from Miami Gardens. And my father worked in the telecom business my whole life. And the telecom business is like AT&T, T-Mobile, kind of just working in phones. And my dad immigrated along with my mom in the late 70s from Haiti. And that was kind of his start. He also went to community college in night school in order to get a degree so that he could transition from, you know, some of the odd jobs he had to work as an immigrant in order to get a more kind of stable full-time work, right? And so my dad worked for a company called MCI WorldCom. And MCI WorldCom was like my dad's, you know, golden star job. It was like full-time work. He got stock options. He was saving for retirement. This was the first job he had the opportunity to do so. So he took all his savings, any extra money he had, put them into retirement with MCI WorldCom. And if you don't remember this, MCI WorldCom had a huge scandal where executives sold off all their stock. They made a ton of money, and all the folks who had invested in MCI WorldCom, along with employees who had invested their money, lost everything. And that included my dad, right? And so when I think about the justice of business, I think about people like my dad, right? I think about the everyday decision makers. There was someone in some room, right, who said, yes, I'm going to sell the stock, or yes, we should go move forward, even though we know that this might fail, right? Those opportunities, the chance to make that decision happens more often than you think. Right. And we're used to thinking of these things in the abstract or things that happen in movies. You know, sometimes you watch like I forgot what it was called, but the movie about Facebook, and you're like, oh, wow, they were making all these decisions. I don't live a life like that. But the reality is we live lives like that every single day. And I think in every business, there are decision makers who have the opportunity to do what's right. And I think that should extend to businesses. And I think that people within, around, and who support or in somehow constituents of businesses should also understand the business sense of social responsibility, right? Every business does something differently, right? My company is that I work for now is a company that's in the business of clinical trials and creating gene therapies, right, to cure severe and rare genetic diseases along with cancers. And so that is our business, right? But if you look at Target, right, I think everyone knows what Target is. Target is a retail store. That's also a business, right? Target's social responsibility may look different than my company's social responsibility. It may look different than community college's social responsibility, but I sincerely believe that every organization, every entity has one, but it looks different for each field, right? And so a lot of what I'll talk about is kind of how do you identify what that is in a business, right? How can you contribute to that work in whatever the work it is that you do, whatever career path you choose to follow. And I want to just say this out loud, right? The opportunity to perform justice work exists in every single discipline. And whether or not you do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, though I would love to have you in the field, there is no one on this call who should feel like, well, I want to do justice work, but I really just want to be an X, right? The opportunity to do justice work exists in every career path, every field that you can imagine. And I'll give you some examples literally of why that is the case and how that is the case. But I just wanted to ground us, right, in this belief that businesses should and can operate in a way that considers their position in the world and their responsibility to do the right thing, right? Fair enough. Yes. With me still, I hope. All right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, right? You heard that my parents immigrated from Haiti. So I shared that. You heard in my bio that I am local to Miami Gardens, Florida, 305 all day. You may have heard that I graduated. I have an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, and my JD. You may that I'm a former high school teacher. So after I graduated from college, my first job out of college was as a high school English teacher, again in South Florida at South Plantation High School, excuse me. And I also am a proud auntie and the youngest of 4 children, right? You'll see in these 2 photos, right? You might be curious, like, what is going on, Jordyne? And there might be like, I'm going to take her invitation back. But here's why I think this is critical. I am a complete and complex person. And what I mean by that is everything that I am, every aspect of my identity, right? Being a girl from Miami. And yes, I listen to and Trick Daddy and Rick Ross, like those are all my favorites. And so I listen to that in my headphones on my way to the office. I do my work, I do great work. And I really fundamentally believe that a lot of my work is centered on creating space for people like me who are a little bit different, right? Who you don't often see in corporate spaces to be able to show up fully as themselves and that be okay because I do great work, right? I believe fundamentally that I am the best in the business at what I do. And I believe that that should grant me permission, right? To show up as my full self and everyone should deal with it, right? And what I mean by that is I hear from people all the time, I'm scared to wear my natural hair. I'm scared to dress as I am. I'm scared to tell someone they mispronounced my name. And so I go by this nickname to make it easier, right? My job is to literally dispel that myth so that by the time you enter the workforce, you never have to do that again, right? You can show up in the full complexities of who you are. Because for a lot of people, they've never had to even consider that. They've never had to consider that their hair or their body type or their accent or where they're from is somehow antithetical to a corporate environment. And I want that experience for every single person, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their sexuality, their gender, any of those factors. And that's kind of how I ground my work. Now, if you remember, I showed you from the first time I donated blood in 2014. And I want to give context around why it took me so long to be a first-time blood donor, and why Sickle Cell Awareness Month was so important to me at that time. Again, I'm a daughter of Haitian immigrants. And so what that means is in the late 80s and early 90s, we were at the height of our HIV/AIDS crisis in the United States and across the world. It was a global pandemic and we were losing people every single day. At the time, very little was known about the HIV and AIDS virus. And so people had myths around how it was transmitted. You could get it from kissing or touching or coughing. And you see some of those parallels today in terms of how we're learning about diseases that we didn't know about before. And what happened was there was a ruling by the FDA that people from sub-Saharan Africa and people from along with people who were LGBTQ could not donate blood, right? And the ban on donations from LGBTQ folks, particularly men who have sex with men, that ban is still in place. It's no longer in place for people from sub-Saharan Africa and people from Haiti, but that ban was in place in the late 80s and early 90s at the sort of crux of my adolescence. So what that meant was I was hearing from my parents, like, we can't even donate blood if we get in a car accident, like, and we won't be able to receive blood. Like, that's a very uncomfortable cultural stigma, right? And what that meant for me growing up was it was kind of awkward to be like, I'm Haitian, right? Because if there's this belief that you can't donate blood, people then said, oh, if you're Haitian, then you have X disease, right? And we didn't know a lot about it. So people would say, I don't want to touch you. You don't cough around me. I don't want to give you a Band-Aid. There were all of these rumors, right? We know a lot more, not as much as we need to, about HIV and AIDS now than we did at that time. But that stigma created something in my mind about giving blood, about that experience, about what it means to be treated differently. And that stuck with me all that time, right? And so here I was in the world as a Black woman. I go to college and I meet my best friend. My best friend, Jessica, has 3 siblings who live with sickle cell disease, right? And through my friendship with Jessica, I learned a lot more about sickle cell disease. I also learned that I have a cousin who has sickle cell disease. I learned that 90% of those living with sickle cell disease are Black folks across sub-Saharan Africa and in the United States, right? And I learned that for folks living with sickle cell, blood donation is critical. In particular, blood donors who are of African descent are critical to sustain their lives and to push them through crises, right? When pain crises, when they have them, right? And so what was transformative about that moment was I decided then, like, hey, Jordyne, it's time to let go of that stigma, even though it's valid, even though it was very real for you, that you have the opportunity to do something that will drastically improve the lives of communities that you care about. And so that was a really big moment for me, that I made that decision to do that. And it's something that I commit myself to do consistently and all the time now. And I encourage y'all, if you haven't yet or are afraid to do it, like, that is a good reason to start, right? And here's why, right? I did not know that years later, I would then work for a company whose business, right, one of the diseases that we are trying to develop therapies to treat is sickle cell disease. And so it was this really special moment that when I got the opportunity to work at my company, that I knew that one of several diseases that we treat include that disease, and that patient population is majority Black, right? And so for me, that was like a full circle moment where I said, this is the place I want to be. This is the place I want to do this work. And I think that's sort of an important context, right, to the work that I do. Now, you might be like, okay, girl, glad to know you, good to know you, but what about the business of justice, right? I give you that context, right? Because I think of the business of justice in several buckets, right? I think of justice makers, right? These are my educators, my coaches, my social workers, right? Why? Because educators, right? They are this incredible force who pour into their students. And what happens with their students is their students are people then, and then they grow up and they go out in the world and they do these incredible things, right? But if you're like me, I was a public school student my whole life. I had these fantastic educators at every level of my lived experience. And I think that everything that I know, the ways that I am able to see the world critically about the work that I do, to do community service work, like is deeply rooted in the foundation set for me by people in my community, like educators, like those coaches, like those social workers who make sure that children and young people have safe places, right, to be, to go to school, to live, to do the wonderful things out in the world. And so I think of those, I think of parents, right? People who are parenting and caregivers as the crux of justice makers, right? So all of, like, okay, we love Dr. King and we love Rosa Parks, and all of those folks had a mama. They had a teacher, they had a mentor who helped pour into them so that they could offer what they offer into the world, right? So that's my one category. My next category are artists. And a lot of times we don't think of artists in this way, but when I think about any of our sort of historical justice movements, when I think about the Black arts and Black power movements sort of coinciding in the 70s, and I'm going to focus a lot on Black experience today because it's Black History Month, and I wouldn't be worth my salt if I didn't say, bam, happy Black History Month, right? And so when I think about those social justice movements, when I think about current movements, the sort of current Black Renaissance, artists are such a critical part of shaping how we see and understand the world, right? They are critical in sort of helping us make sense of the world around us in a way that's accessible, right? In a way that's relatable. They create characters we relate to. And you think about TV shows that were groundbreaking, right? Those very special episodes of shows that helped us understand things that we didn't or weren't familiar with. Like, that is the power of art, right? Justice workers. So these are folks who I identify as like directly in the community. These are community organizers, activists, attorneys who do public service work, public defenders, lawyers, doctors, folks doing Doctors Without Borders, et cetera. Anyone working to ensure or combat gentrification, ensure equitable housing. These are folks who I think are like direct service justice workers, right? Then you have the kind of like corporate justice work, and that's where I sit. That's my little dot. That's not really me, but that's where I sit. And that's where I identify your diversity, equity, and inclusion heads, people who are in charge of corporate social responsibility, people who do environmentalist work, maybe some government work for corporate businesses. And that's kind of the bucket that I live in. And you might be like, but I thought you were a lawyer. I am, but I don't kind of put myself in that bucket because I don't practice, right? I don't go to court. I don't sue folks or do those things, right? So that's why I'm not in that bucket. And then I think of the catch-all, right? For me, which is justice everywhere, energy workers. If you are looking at Texas right now, there's a lot of justice to happen. And when we think about energy, when we think about people who work for government organizations like FEMA and making sure that people have disaster recovery relief, when you think about software engineers, people who are working on our computers and our technology, entrepreneurs, people who are running small businesses in communities, scientists, right? My colleagues in businesses like the ones that I work in, who are working on curative therapies, who are working on solving really complicated problems to make sure that people can live healthy and full lives. And if COVID-19 has taught us anything, we're talking about frontline workers, right? And the critical work that they do in making sure that, hey, how do you think all of those supplies get delivered to hospitals? The critical work of folks who work for the Postal Service, folks who work for UPS, folks who work in truckers, who work in transportation logistics. All of that is justice work, right? You don't have to be a community organizer or an activist to do justice work. It's really in who you are and how you approach your work. But there's honor and dignity in all of that work, right? So what do I do? You know, I'm in that justice, corporate justice bucket. What do I do as a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional? So some of the things I do, I use data to understand employee or customer experience, right? So I'm constantly wanting to know, what is our demographic breakdown of our workforce, right? What percentages of what buckets do we have? How many women do we have in the workforce? How many women do we have in leadership? How many women do we have in our scientific roles versus our non-scientific roles? I'm constantly looking at that data. I'm looking at market data. How many women scientists are graduating with PhDs or PharmDs, right? Because I want to know who's available in the business market. I am training and educating on issues of culture, diversity, and implicit bias, right? And so I'm going like literally like I'm in a classroom and I'm talking to people and teaching them about bias, about privilege, power, all of these concepts, right? I'm teaching them about proper terms, how to understand the difference between gender identity and sexuality. All of these things that you are probably learning or doing in your activities, maybe that you're learning or experiencing in your orientations. All of those things are happening in the corporate space too. And so as you're entering the world, if you choose to go into private practice or in a corporation, the expectation is that you have that knowledge too. So I'm kind of working behind the curve, right? Because generationally, a lot of that education, a lot of what we know now didn't exist 20, 30, even 15 years ago, right? And so in some ways we're playing catch up so that people know about those concepts. I'm working on or with supplier diversity programs, right?
Hi, Morris.
Diversity campaign or business initiatives. So what I mean by that is, if you look at Target, I love Target. I'm going to go there after this, right? So I want to use them as a great example because I really love Target, because Black History Month is now, and Target partnered, right, with Black owned businesses. They spotlighted those businesses. They went to diverse suppliers, so Black owned businesses. So they're like, not just, hey, let's say Happy Black History Month and change our logo or color it a different color, but let's pour our resources into those communities, right? A diversity, equity, and inclusion professional so presumably does things like, right? And so when I think about our patient population, thinking about our partnerships in the sort of external facing world, it's thinking about the language that we use on our advertisements or in our Twitter feeds, anything like that. It's thinking about the education that has to happen internally so we understand our customer and clients. Like, you can't serve people whose lives you do not understand. And that's an example, but the same would hold true. We also celebrated Lunar New Year just last week, right? And so it's understanding, right, that just like we say Happy New Year on January 1st, that we should also say Happy Lunar New Year, right? Because we have Asian American and Pacific Islander folks in our population who celebrate Lunar New Year, right? It's that understanding that we are in a world where people celebrate, do, and experience different things than what we consider our standard or our usual. Part of my work is also helping to remove barriers and increase access for underrepresented or historically oppressed people, right? And so at the top of the hour, they mentioned your STEM program that specifically targets and supports women and underrepresented minorities in STEM fields, right? So if you can imagine, there's a whole field where those two groups are underrepresented. When you go into them, you don't see people who look like you. You may not have had a woman of color be your science teacher or your math teacher before, right? You don't see that representation. We also know that just because we don't see the representation, that's not the end of the work, right? What that means is once you enter the workforce, you may encounter, right, that there are people who have trouble recognizing your skill set in the same ways they might if you were a man, right? Or if you were white. That is real. Those biases exist, right? Because the field has been what it is. Part of my work is sort of taking the veil off of that and uncovering the fact that that is sort of a reality for us. And how do we create interventions to make sure that we are both supporting our professionals who are underrepresented, we're creating opportunities so that they can succeed, that we're understanding that they are capable able and in many times best suited to lead us, right? And so making sure that that's an agreement and an understanding across the organization is a critical part of the work of a DEI professional. And the last piece is helping individuals and institutions understand the impact of inequity in our society, right? So we don't live single issue lives. And what I mean by that is, if you're a scientist and you're working on a curative therapy in a lab, right? We talk a lot about this. Yeah, you work on it in a lab and then they put it out and no one can access it. Or we find out that the ways in which they access it don't fit their lifestyles, right? That's a lack of awareness and understanding about the world around us and inequity. I'll take COVID as an example. We do not work on COVID, so that is not our business, but we are a similar type of business, right? Where the same type of ways that Moderna or Pfizer created the COVID vaccination, right? There is an element of working in a lab and creating a vaccine, but there is an element of making sure that the trial participants, so the people that we're making sure that this vaccination works on, are as diverse as the people who will possibly contract COVID. So what we saw in the field was that COVID was disproportionately impacting Black and Latinx communities, particularly in the United States, right? And so we can't have a trial of all white participants and then distribute the vaccination to diverse communities without understanding how they might impact, how they might counteract other drugs that folks are taking, how they might work in different body types, different lifestyle types, depending on the type of work that you do, how people can access the vaccine quite literally, right? And so a part of my work is helping institutions and individuals in them understand those barriers, understand the differences in access to healthcare or any other kind of work related to the work that I do, so that we can provide the best product to all of our constituents, all of our patients, all of our clients, right? Because you don't want to develop something that works for 30% of your potential populace, right? Because not only does that not make sense from the, like, we actually want to help people lens, but it doesn't make sense from the, if you need to make money lens, right? If you have a customer base that could be 100%, but your product only serves 30%, then you make 30% of the money that you could make instead of 100%, right? We don't think like that because we do things around curing diseases, so it doesn't quite work the same way. But I'd imagine that for Target or for retail stores or for other operators, that they are having to think about those things as well, right? So I want to talk for a second about the things that we interrogate. And what I mean by that is, what questions are we seeking answers to? And so some of those for me are, what is the racial, ethnic, gender, or other demographic makeup of the organization? Are there any disparities in things like pay, salaries, promotions, access to opportunities between these groups? So you might see different companies like Starbucks or some of the other big say, we've closed the racial and gender pay gap. Why? What does that mean? Well, what that means is, because of how society works, right? Because we know that different races and genders have access to higher paying jobs, there creates a pay gap. We know that women oftentimes have to leave the workforce or have, because of childcare responsibilities, we know that women tend to take on the bulk of caregiving responsibilities, even when both parties work in cis het relationships, right? And so what that means is we have to make up the gap, right? And so if you ever applied for a job and they say, well, what did you make at your last job? And they base your salary based on what you made at your last job. If you start off from behind, if you get paid $10,000 less than your white counterparts at your first job, and then you go to your next job and they say, well, we'll pay you just $2,000 more than you got paid at your last job, well, that creates a gap. And that gap becomes bigger and bigger and bigger as time goes on. And so part of our work is to say, like, how do we make sure that we create pay practices so that regardless of your identity or your lived experience, if you're doing the same job, you have access to the same pay, right? Because you're delivering the same product, right? Is there a stated commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how does the organization invest in it? So there's one thing to have a word or a paragraph on a website, but the questions I would ask of an organization are, what is the budget that you allot to your diversity, equity, and inclusion team or professional? Do you have someone full-time whose work is dedicated to this? How much time do you spend as an organization focusing on these issues of equity or justice, right? Those are questions that we have to ask, because for some organizations, they're probably like, yes, I have a statement, but the budget is $4. Well, that doesn't match, right? You know, we need the money to do the work, right? What is the diversity of our customer base, and how do we offer services that value those different experiences? So when I think about that, I'm like, hey, if you have a customer base who has disabilities and they're deaf or hard of hearing, or they are vision impaired, are you offering accessibility services? Are you closed captioning? Right? What are we doing to ensure that we say, we know that you're here and we want to make sure that you feel included and supported in getting access to whatever our product or our business is, right? So those are the types of things that we ask and that we interrogate, and that we seek to find answers to. So I know that was a lot, right? But what I really want to ground us in are a few headlines. Because I want you to see what this looks like in real time. So when I think of justice work, I literally mean the spectrum and the span of all work. There's an opportunity to do justice work. So if you're familiar with the Black Mamas Bailout and the abolition of cash bail, these are community activists who are working to ensure that folks who are legally innocent, so these are folks who have not been tried in the court of law, they are accused and they are arrested, and there's literally a system where the difference of $200 means that they are staying in custody, which means they don't have childcare, they don't have access to their jobs so that they can contribute to their households, and this disproportionately impacts women, particularly Black women, because they are primary caregivers very often in their households, right? Those are community activists who are on the ground literally raising funds so that we can get these mamas out of jail and home, right? And so that they can be active and engaged in their community, right? And this is incredible and important work. I think about my technologists. So if you're on here and you're like, I want to be a software engineer, there's a study that found, oh, I love Tesla, I love self-driving cars, right? If you are interested in engineering work, right? There was a study that found that self-driving cars failed to detect dark-skinned pedestrians. As a dark-skinned woman, I am very concerned about the technology that may not recognize me crossing the street, right? There is absolutely justice work in doing technology work, right? I want to see dark-skinned engineers in those labs to make sure that when we create this really amazing technology, that there's opportunity for me as a citizen to be safe in it. There's a focus on Black-owned businesses. If you are into cosmetology, there's a barbershop in Akron that also serves as a community center that hosts meetings for young gentlemen in the community to talk about the impact of violence and the impact violence has on their communities. My partner is a barber. And so I think a lot about the role that barbershops and beauty shops play in communities as sources of therapeutic services, right? As we knew from COVID shutdowns, people were like, y'all gotta open up the shop. Like, you can keep everything else closed, but the barbershop and the beauty shop has to open. So if you're interested in that, there's opportunity for justice work there. Mental health providers, COVID has shown us that requests for mental health services have skyrocketed to the point where health providers are struggling to meet the demand. We need more mental health therapists. Like, we need more therapists. People need to access therapy more. Kizzmekia Corbett, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, Dr. Kizzy Corbett was one of the virologists and immunologists who was foundational in our discovery and ability to have a COVID vaccine today. She's from a small town in North Carolina. She's a Black woman who accessed a STEM program just like yours. And she credits her interest in biology to a high school biology teacher who inspired her to do this work. We need Black doctors to work on COVID vaccinations and any other vaccinations that we need. When I think about Maya Moore, the athlete who gave up her season to exonerate a man who was wrongfully imprisoned and eventually freed, we need justice workers who are athletes. When I think about the Utah school who made Black History Month optional and then reversed itself, we need justice workers on school boards. We need justice workers in classrooms to validate students of color and women students. We need justice workers, right, in those fields. And when I think about Virginia, I'm going to bring it full circle and home to you, right? There was a commission that studied the vestiges of inequity and inequality in Virginia's laws and published this report, 100-page report that literally details how inequities in Virginia's laws have tangible impacts today on housing, healthcare, access to services, particularly for people of color. This is the incredible work of justice workers, right? So when I think about the business of justice, I think about everyone on that commission. I wasn't on it. Everyone on that commission was a justice worker. Everyone who was responsible for ensuring that that Utah school reversed their decision was a justice worker. Dr. Kizzy Corbett is a justice worker. Maya Moore is a justice worker. The outstanding and incredible community organizers who are bailing out Black mothers and returning them home to their families are justice workers. And so my question to you is, who will you be as a justice worker? And you have the opportunity to do that regardless of the path that you choose. I welcome you to choose this one, but whatever path you choose, I hope that that creates opportunity for you to see yourself as a justice worker, because the work is vast, it's important, it's needed, it's incredible, and it's available to you, whatever path you choose. So that's all I had to share, and I welcome your questions. So I'll stop sharing so I can see the,
Thank you, Jordyne. I mean, oh my gosh, wow. So much amazing information. And it just all goes back to the reason why we're doing this work. We want to encourage more diversity everywhere. And I love how you said justice everywhere, no matter where you are, what career, where you are in life, you can contribute to this work. So I know we have 20 minutes. I want us to be able to get questions in. So please, we had some great comments in the chat as well, just focused on what you mentioned about the corporate world and how sometimes it's a challenge to be yourself in that space. So thank you all for the comments in the chat as well. Can we open up the floor to questions, student questions, attendee questions? Feel free to unmute yourselves. No?
don't be shy.
I have a question.
Thank you.
Jordyne, thank you so much again for doing this. This was such an eye-opening and inspiring thing to sit and listen in on. So thank you so much for doing this. For someone like me, I'm very interested. I'm hoping to major in politics when I transfer and eventually get a degree in law. So your story is really inspiring for me. And I was just, sorry about that. And I was just wondering what inspired you, not to go the traditional route of becoming, an attorney. And, you got your law degree, but you did so many things that maybe aren't expected of law graduates. So what kind of inspired you, or what influenced you to go other routes, and how did you find those opportunities?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you for asking, and thank you for being here. My gratitude extends to you as well. So I would say a combination of circumstances, right? So one is I actually went to law school because I was very interested in, at the time, school desegregation. So I was like, we still have segregated schools. I want to go to the Supreme Court and argue against segregated schools. And then I got to law school because, I didn't know anything. I just was like, this is my lived experience. And they were like, the Supreme Court doesn't take those cases anymore. They've moved on, boys and girls, right? And I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I got to pivot. And so, but I knew that I was interested in civil rights work. So what I can say is when I graduated, a combination of two things happened. One, I graduated and I'm a millennial and the economy was trash. So I couldn't even find a job. So I would love to believe that I had a really like the pick of the litter choice, but I kind of was like, where can I work? And I'll work anywhere. So I was waiting tables and I was working as a legislative counsel for who is now the current mayor of DC. So I actually did end up in politics, but she was at the time a council person and she's now the mayor of DC. So kind of what I did in that space was write legislation. I worked with constituents. I worked with economic development to kind of help. We were at the time bringing Walmarts to DC for the first time. So that was a really big deal. And so that kind of found me, but I was still really trying to scrape my way back to something related more to civil rights, or something that had to do with like civil rights law. I just couldn't quite figure it out. So I actually ended up taking a job again in the local government, working for the Department of Transportation, where I did civil rights work there as well. And what I did for the Department of Transportation was make sure that things like your bus and your train stations had accessible signage. There were accessible walking signals, that when we built bus stops, we weren't building them in the middle of certain communities. So there was like actually a rich legacy of civil rights work in transportation that I just didn't know about. And so one of the biggest things that I think that kind of a sucky economy afforded me was it exposed me to things I didn't know, and probably career paths I wouldn't have chosen. So in some ways, while it was terrible, I'm not gonna lie, I was very broke, but and it wouldn't be the first time or the last time I'd be broke. But what I can say that it afforded me was the opportunity to not necessarily just follow like, okay, you graduate law school, then you go to a law firm, right? Or you got to work at a certain clinic, et cetera. And so I kind of did a lot of different things, and it gave me time, honestly, to find the like really nice mix of what I believe my best skill set is, and the places and things that make me the most happy. And so from that civil rights work, I actually ended up working at a university. And so my career before I was in corporate America was, I was a Title IX coordinator. That may be super familiar to y'all now. And so I worked with survivors of domestic violence, relationship violence, sexual assault, et cetera. I was an investigator for civil rights violations in higher education. So any discrimination or harassment types of cases. And those offices also had diversity offices. So we would work together with the diversity office, say, to do a training. And what I found was, one, it's really, really hard to do that work. It's really emotionally taxing. And so, and I commend the justice workers who do that work. And so hug your Title IX coordinator with consent, of course, but they need it. And so what I found was I really enjoyed the education. I really enjoyed the strategy. I really enjoyed kind of figuring out how to change behaviors as opposed to just correcting them after the fact, if that makes sense. And so that's kind of where I found my sweet spot of doing diversity work. And transition to the corporate space over time. But while I would love to say I had it all figured out, I mean, half of it was just, I kind of just took whatever job I could get because I had loans, student loans to pay and rent to pay. And it just kind of all worked out in the end. But I would say, you know, if I were interested, or if you're interested in law school, I think it opens up a lot of doors and opportunities for you to do a variety of work. And to kind of take, you know, in law school, you can do clinics, you can intern. And so I would use that opportunity to kind of test the waters in different areas relative or adjacent to the law to maybe see what, you know, feels the best for you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Riley, for that question. That was an amazing question. And thank you, Jordyne, for your response. I think it's so relevant that you said, you know, I'm imagining you may have graduated around 07, 08 when that crisis was, that's when I graduated too. But it's just, you know, I feel like we're going through a similar issue right now, and a lot of our soon to be graduates will be faced with maybe having to pivot their, you know, primary career goal that they had, and just thinking about it differently and adjusting and adapting to where we are now. So that just shows that, you know, you can either A, you know, soak in it, or B, go out there and create your own opportunities. So thank you for sharing that. That's powerful.
Absolutely. Y'all don't know, it was a lot of job applications. Let me tell you, it was a lot of rejection before, but I just needed one yes, and I got the one yes. So I empathize very deeply with the kind of economy that we're facing.
Absolutely.
I think that's so true, Jordyne. When we think about even now today, it's really also about our skill set and how that skill set really can be placed in a variety of different environments. And so it's really good for our students to realize that when you hone in on a certain skill set, despite what you think, you know, the industry path would be for you, making sure that you are being able to use that skill set and know your skill set to really be able to be flexible and adjust in any environment. But more importantly, now you brought a new dynamic, which is not only your skill set, but then who you are as a person, your value system, which is really, really important. I actually have a question And I guess my question is, when we think about, no doubt we are in two different generations. And so I know from, being in education and then also talking to our students about just that subject of how to navigate when they are in their workspace or when they do join their career path. What does that look like, and how to make sure that they're able to navigate that in a way, which is really difficult without, until you really experience it sometimes, right? And so I heard you speak about making sure that you kind of be yourself, you are comfortable with yourself, people not adjusting their name, so that it's easier for other people to pronounce and that sort of thing. But do you think that there's kind of a balance to that when we think about deciding on where you're working or where you're going to work, and then realizing and really coming to know that environment or that dynamic, and then if choosing to work there, there may be some adjustment, unless you simply say, okay, I'm not going to choose to work there, I'm going to work here because this really fits better with who I am. Kind of talk about that dynamic, because at the same time, we also kind of run the risk of, hey, we got bills to pay, we have our loans to pay and that sort of thing. I mean, how would our students, when we think about a younger generation, kind of balance that? That seems to be, I'm sure that's difficult as well.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. And I think of a couple of things. One is our workforce is rapidly changing in real time, right? If this year taught us anything, there were companies that were like, you can't work from home. And now they're like, I guess we got no choice. We'll figure it out, right?
Let's sell the building.
And we're adjusting in real time. So I do think that there's an element of the workforce and the workplace as we know it is constantly changing. And so being adaptable and able to kind of pivot and change and show up as your best self is sometimes difficult, and it is a consistent balance. The other thing I always say to anyone, and this is a philosophy that I live by, I do my best work. And when I show up, let me say this, I'm going to say this about myself, and then I'm going to give advice that I would give, more broadly. I know who I am, right? I don't like to change my hair. I like to wear my lipstick. I like my outfit, as I would call it, an outfit. I like to show up fully as myself. I understand, though, that I live in a world where a lot of times that either rubs people the wrong way, or they're like, I'm not used to that, right? And so, one, that does sometimes come with risk, because I've been in environments where I've showed up as myself and I'm like, I'm going to do what I think is right. And they're like, this is not a good fit, right? But I knew going in, I was prepared for the consequences of that, because for me, it was most important to show up fully as myself. And I knew that I could trust that my work is flawless. Like my work is on point, right? So when I show up, yes, you might be mad. You might be like, I'm tired of her locks. I'm tired of her lipstick, but you're going to know you're going to get the best out of me every single time. So that's like my just grounding principle as a person. Absolutely. Do your best work, and you tend to get more and more permission to be and do whatever you want, right? It's almost like when LeBron wants to wear something, like no one tells LeBron James like, okay, don't wear that because he's LeBron James. You can't, okay, I'll fall back, right? You're LeBron, right? So there's that. But what I will say is it was important for me to understand the different industries that I was working with, right? And so I think it's always a balance and a negotiation, because I think there's a fine line between being yourself and also honoring the environment that you're in. And I do think that there's a way to do that that's culturally competent and sensitive, right? And so what I mean by that is I'm young, I'm different, but when I go into a Black church, right, I'm gonna fall back, right? Because I have reverence for that environment, and I'm gonna show up in a way that honors that space because I think it deserves that, right? And similarly, if I were working in insurance or banking, right? They have pretty strict parameters around what they wear. So you can't really go into banking and be like, I want to wear my pajamas to work. But if you want to work at Red Hat, GitHub, one of those tech companies, they would love for you to wear your pajamas, right? And so sometimes it's like knowledge and awareness of company culture and what type of company it is. but what I said earlier holds true, right? Like what I have on isn't what makes me a justice worker. Like, you know, the fact that I wear my hair natural, or I, you know, wear this or do this or speak like this is not really what makes me a justice worker. It's really that I find inherent value in everyone, right? It's really that when you speak with an accent, I'm more like excited. Like, I love your accent. Where are you from? Right? I treat it with dignity. I treat other people with respect. So for me, it's more like grounding myself in that. And I'm like, you know, I do have friends who are like, I gotta wear a suit every day. Like, am I a sellout? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, can you pay your rent? Then maybe you're not, right? I think we are negotiating every day how to, like, just enough to sacrifice and just enough to say. But just know that sometimes that does come with real consequences. Like, some people don't vibe with that energy, and you know, you're going to have to navigate that and be prepared for that. And so hopefully that you can find a careful balance, and honor that for some people, they don't have as much flexibility. Like, I am very lucky that I work at a tech company, and we, you know, it's just kind of like anything goes. They would be like, you're super dressed up today, Jordyne. And I'm just like, I like fashion, so I'm going to dress up. But if I were at a bank, they would be like, nah, girl, you can't come in with that. You know, it just depends. Yeah.
I love that, Jordyne. I hear preparation, I hear awareness, and most and foremost, I hear really kind of showing what you do by your actions rather than, you know, words and appearance, but your actions, your work ethic speaks volumes. So thank you for that. That's really great.
Absolutely.
Hi, can I pivot quickly back to your point about sickle cell, and I have a niece and a grandson who has sickle cell. My niece, she's older, and so she had a crisis and went into the hospital. And oftentimes when she does that, she gets from some of the people in the medical field that she's drug seeking. That's a big stigma when it comes to sickle cell, that there's drug seekers. And so how do you see equity being applied when it comes to the medical field?
I think that is a brilliant question. And we hear that a lot from our patient populations, that they are profiled essentially as drug seeking, or that there's studies that show that people believe that Black people experience less pain. So they won't give them as much pain medication, because they literally believe biologically, like when a Black person says my pain is at a 10, they're like, that must be an 8. So we're not going to give you as much. So, you know, this goes back to my point about justice work being like, doctors need to be engaged in justice work, right? And that is absolutely the impact and the legacy of racism and implicit bias in the medical profession writ large, from nurses to doctors to the people at the checkout counter, making assumptions about whether you can pay for your care, all types of experiences, particularly that we see our sickle patients experience. And so a lot of that work, honestly, is what I call wide reaching. So some of it is around, how do we get more Black hematologists? How do we get more medical professionals of color, any color, right? Who tend to have more sensitivity to those issues. And we see in research now, we have disproportionate health outcomes for Black mothers who are birthing. We have disproportionate health outcomes for Black patients writ large, because they're just not receiving that experience. The other piece is education and development for doctors. And quite frankly, like, that for hospital systems to say that type of treatment is not acceptable, right? There are lots of people who still go to the hospital and doctors don't understand sickle cell disease. They're not really as familiar with it, even in like larger cities. And so we hear from patients like, I'm nervous about moving, or I'm nervous about traveling, and I have a pain crisis while I'm on vacation somewhere, right? And so when I think about like sort of our global education, it's sessions like these that, like, I don't know what careers any of you are going to, but like when you go home and you talk to your neighbors and your friends and your family, and you're like, oh, I learned about sickle cell today. Like, how are you spreading information about these different experiences so that, you know, for your niece, I think you said your niece and your cousin, I'm gonna mess that up, so that when they go to the doctor, they're receiving the best care possible. Or when they go back to work and they say, I had a pain crisis, so I had to be out of work for 5 days, that they're not like, okay, well, you're fired, or you can't work here anymore, right? They're experiencing life beyond just the medical profession too. And so it's important for us, as we learn and raise our global consciousness, to just do better all around, to be aware of these experiences of other people.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for, you're dropping some jewels on us today. And I hope everyone in here is inspired and motivated to create justice where you are, whatever major you're in or whatever you are pursuing. So I see that the time is 1 o'clock. So I just want to thank, first of all, everybody for coming. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I want to thank Jordyne for being here today and blessing us with her presence. And also thanking the Business, Computer Science, and IT Pathway and the Virtual Student Center. Any last minute words, Nancy?
Yes, I too want to thank Jordyne. Thank you so much. That was wonderful, absolutely impactful. And I thank the many students that are here with us today, but I also thank our community that has joined us, as well as both externally and internally, our community. So thank you guys for joining us. And thank you, Jada, for doing such an excellent job and moderating, and Alicia as well, and helping our tech skills here. So I just wanted to reiterate that, as you know, that we're having this monthly virtual speaker series. And so our next event is in March. And I wanted to kind of pull that up, but it's going to be March 18th, again at 12 p.m. And the name of the event is Closing the Gap, Making Space for Women in Engineering, Computer Science, Economics, and Cybersecurity, in partnership with our Women's Center again. And so that is going to be amazing. We're going to have a panel of female executives that are in those spaces, that is able to talk with you from a lot of different lenses. And so I hope you can join us on the March 18th for our next event. Thank you again, Jordyne. You know, we had this discussion quite a few times to speak to different audiences. And so it's amazing how every time we have it, it just brings a whole new lens and a whole new perspective. You know, the first time I gave it myself to a group of entrepreneurs, you know, second time we talked to a group of educators, and now you came with a view of speaking to our students, and every single one was kind of this different dynamic. So amazing. Thanks again. I hope to see you again soon with us. Would love for you to join us anytime, and we will be in touch. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Go change the world.